right, we are ready to go. Welcome everyone to the League of Women Voters of California's webinar, California's Immigration Protections, Resistance, and Resilience. We're really excited for you to join us tonight. We have a great panel of experts here, and we are looking forward to this discussion with you all. I want to go ahead first with some introductions for you all, and I want to start us by introducing our lovely moderator for the evening, Melanie Kim. Melanie is the state policy director at the San Francisco Public Defender's Office, where she champions state policy and advocacy initiatives that prevent our community members from being funneled into our criminal punishment system, disrupt and shrink the criminal punishment system, and ensure that the public defender clients and their loved ones are given the maximum amount of care and support. Melanie came to the San Francisco Public Defender's Office with experience in deportation defense, as well as state and local policy advocacy. Before venturing into policy work, Melanie worked as a deportation defense attorney, providing direct legal service in private practice, and most recently at the Asian Law Caucus, where she focused on representing individuals who face deportation due to criminal convictions. Thank you so much for being here, Melanie, and now I'll turn it over to you to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Savannah, and thank you for everyone joining us on a Wednesday after work. It's my pleasure to introduce our three presenters and panelists for this evening. So I'll start with Pedro Rios. Pedro is the director of the American Friends Service Committee's U.S.-Mexico Border Program. In his 22-year tenure with the American Friends Service Committee, Pedro has worked with recently arrived migrants, those who have established roots in their respective communities, San Diego policymakers, and global leaders. He has served on the Southern Border Communities Coalition and National Network for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, and the San Diego Immigrant Rights Consortium. Pedro is also a founding member of the Friends of International Friendship Park, a binational park at the U.S.-Mexico border. As a global advocate, he served as an expert consultant with the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Migrants. Pedro engages proactively with decision makers and has worked closely with local leaders on issues like curtailing law enforcement's application of surveillance technologies. Thank you for being here, Pedro. Next, Gustavo Rios became the investigative border reporter at KPBS in 2021. He was born in Mexico City, grew up in San Diego, and has 2 passports to prove it. He graduated from Columbia University's School of Journalism in 2013 and has worked in New York City, Miami, Palm Springs, Los Angeles, and San Diego. In 2018, he was part of a team of reporters who shared a Pulitzer Prize for explanatory journalism. Thank you for being here, Gustavo. And lastly, we have Jason Berkovich, who currently serves as the district director and policy advisor to Congressman Scott Peters, where he has been working since 2013. Jason manages a portfolio focused on foreign affairs, immigration, financial services, and outreach to local small businesses and faith-based communities, while also helping oversee district office operations. Prior to joining Representative Peters' office, Jason was an intern for former Congresswoman Susan Davis. Jason spent most of his childhood in Puerto Rico and is a fluent Spanish speaker. So thank you, Gustavo, Pedro, and Jason for being here this evening. Now, each of you will provide us with a snapshot of what immigration policy looks like from your vantage points. Jason, would you like to start us off on the federal landscape?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you to the League of Women Voters California, and particularly thank you to Melanie, Savannah, Christy, and the rest of the team for including me in tonight's discussion. Of course, this is a very pressing topic, particularly in San Diego, where I'm located, and across the country. Unfortunately, when it comes to immigration, I like to say, in my opinion, our immigration system is one of the saddest casualties of the current divide that we have in our nation, and the increased polarization that we're seeing in tandem with that divide. Really, it's, there's a real lack of communication and of cooperation, sadly, at this point, between Democrats and Republicans. And the reason why I say the immigration system is one of the saddest casualties is because this might be one of the few issues that everybody seems to agree on. Every Republican in Congress, every Democrat in Congress, even President Trump, President Biden, President Obama, I mean, you can go back years, everyone seems to agree our system is broken. But yet, we are unable to do anything about it. And one of the main reasons that we're not able to do anything is simply the lack of communication and the lack of willingness to compromise by members of both sides of the aisle. Now, we've had proposals that have been introduced before that passed the House. We've had proposals that passed the Senate just within the last 10 to 15 years. But unfortunately, those proposals are not taken up by the other House of Congress. So whether it's the House of Representatives not taking up proposals that pass the Senate or the Senate not taking up proposals that pass the House, we basically end up with no changes overall. So where I would like to start is, what do we all know? Which is, we all know what we want to fix. And that's why it makes it so depressing that we haven't been able to fix it. And I'll start with the one that there seems to be a lot of agreement on, which is our green card system and how people become permanent residents and citizens. Depending on where you're from, as many of you might know, there is a massive backlog in terms of being able to obtain family-based green cards for people from, for example, Mexico or the Philippines, India. There's also a large backlog of employment-based green cards, particularly for people from China, from India, and from several other countries as well. Everyone admits that that's a problem, yet we don't fix it. One of the things that we all know causes that problem is that we have per country caps, which limit how many green cards can be issued to people from each country around the world. Now, if we look at the caps, you can take a country like, for example, Guyana or Djibouti, and rarely do we hit the maximum number of green cards that are allocated for those countries, but yet we consistently hit the maximum number for Mexico, China, India, etc. Now, that means green cards are actually not getting used. We allocate every single year less green cards than what Congress has approved simply because of these per country caps. And everyone admits that that's a problem, but yet we still can't fix it. Let's look at another one that people admit that's a problem. Staffing levels. Whether, agree or disagree, and I understand that there's a lot of concerns with regards to staffing, but the reality is that within the Department of Homeland Security, particularly Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection, Border Patrol largely handling enforcement in between the ports of entry, Customs and Border Protection largely handling at the ports and people that are coming through the ports, we know that their staffing has simply not kept pace with the amount of traffic of people showing up at our border, particularly at the ports of entry. Here in San Diego, we've invested, and Imperial County as well, we've invested almost $1 billion with a B, almost $1 billion with a B over the last 15 years in the modernization and expansion of the San Isidro point of entry, the Otay Mesa port of entry, the Calexico point of entry, and there's even one more, which I apologize, I'm blanking on. But these ports have all been expanded. They've all been modernized. We have new lanes. We have new technology, but yet staffing has not kept pace. So consistently, we're hurting our own economy and we're hurting the environment as well because trucks and cars are just sitting at the border waiting to be processed day in and day out. Everyone admits that the staffing doesn't align with the size of our ports of entry and the amount of traffic that they're handling, but yet we're still not doing anything to improve that. And in fact, I'll add another one which doesn't get as much attention, but because San Diego International Airport is in our district, TSA as well. I mean, I'm sure for those that have traveled through the airport recently, I don't know the last time that I saw every single lane open. Usually there's like 8, 9 lanes, and you might have 2 or 3 TSA agents on a good day. So the reality is that we know that we're short-staffed, and yet we're not investing in making our ports more efficient, which in turn hurts our own economy by delaying people's ability to travel. And particularly with business, it delays a lot of imports and exports. Another few that I'll bring up, and then we'll talk about kind of some of the other issues, is the immigration courts. One thing that people may not realize is that the immigration courts are a quasi-legal system. The immigration courts themselves are actually under the Department of Justice. They are not part of the independent judiciary branch of government. So there are a lot of concerns, and there's been legislation that's been introduced that would actually make the immigration courts a real judiciary constitutional court. Because right now, what you see is the attorney general can come in from one administration and decide, here's the policy, and hands it down to all our immigration judges. And then 4 years later or 8 years later, let's say there's a transition in administration, you have a new attorney general. The new attorney general can decide, nope, I don't like what was happening before. I'm just going to come up with a new policy. So even from a legal perspective, it's very difficult for immigration attorneys when the Attorney General could essentially change the rules of how the immigration courts function on any day or any hour, and the judges have to follow that rule because they are not independent. They are not an independent branch. They are housed under the Department of Justice. So there's talk about making the immigration courts an actual independent judiciary branch court system. Couple more, particularly that impact here in San Diego, that we know are an issue, and there's generally agreement in this being a problem, but yet we're still not resolving it. First, we got temporary protected status. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of changes recently to TPS and who it applies to, and there's been some rescissions that are highly contentious. But we have individuals here in this country from Haiti, from Nicaragua, from Cuba, from Honduras, from Venezuela, from Afghanistan, which very few people would argue, well, their home countries are safe for them to go back now. I mean, you look at what's going on in Haiti right now, you look at the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, there's not many Americans out there that would say, yeah, I think I want to go to Afghanistan because it's so safe right now. Or, yeah, maybe I should go over to Sudan. I hear Sudan is beautiful this time of year. I mean, the reality is that these countries are very much unstable, and yet TPS is being rescinded and people could potentially be deported. But what's the systemic issue with TPS? Well, it's because we haven't given these people a pathway for more permanency here in the United States. It's not like it's a secret, the instability in these countries, and it's not like this is something that just started up. This has been going on for many, many years, but yet we've never provided a mechanism in order for the migrants from these countries to fully integrate here in the United States, and they'd be able to create a pathway for them to really build a permanent life here in the United States, as opposed to always having that threat hanging over their head about returning to their home country. And then the last one, which I'll bring up, is Dreamers and DACA. There's almost universal agreement across the board, even when it's amongst Democrats and Republicans, that if you've grown up in this country, you've never violated the law, this is the only country you've ever known in your entire life. You were brought here as a baby, you don't know your home country, you don't know what language was spoken there, then you should be allowed to stay here. You are quintessential American. You speak English, you graduated our high schools, middle schools, universities, you work for the armed services, you work in law enforcement, you got a job, you're opening your own businesses. We should be creating a system in which Dreamers can attain permanent final status here in the United States. Many would say citizenship, others would say let's have a pathway that starts at a green card. But there's agreement that we should be doing something for Dreamers, and most Americans seem to agree with that as well. And yet, unfortunately, because of the lack of communication between Democrats and Republicans, we're not making any progress on these issues. And again and again and again, what we see is from one administration to the other, the pendulum continues to swing based on the administration's priority. So really, from a federal perspective, the main thing that we really focus on is what are the laws today? And it's important to remind people of what those laws are today. And if you have an objection to the laws today, which there are many objections out there, then the proper way to fix it is to negotiate a change to that law. For too long, the immigration system has essentially been surviving on executive orders from GW to Obama to Trump to Biden. It's been managed by executive orders. And that essentially just continues the problem. We're not actually resolving it. So my hope, and I'm excited about the conversation today, is that we can eventually move in a direction where Democrats and Republicans can come together. They can make some sacrifices that neither side is going to be happy with, but that's the key to compromise. And eventually we can get some bills passed to actually improve this system that everybody knows is broken. So I think that's a pretty good place for us to start off, and then I'll turn it back to you, Melanie.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, Pedro, how would you describe the immigration policy landscape on both the local and state levels?
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you to the League of Women Voters for the invitation, and all of you who are joining us this evening. It's wonderful to be here. And thank you, Jason, for that overview. I would say that contextually, I would like to first begin by saying that as from an advocate's perspective and having done this work for many years, oftentimes the questions around immigration and specifically around border communities tend to center on what I would say is a legacy of the prevention through deterrence strategy that Border Patrol put in practice in the mid-90s, that we continue to see its effects today. So if we look at policies that have been in place from every administration since the Clinton administration, they tend to center around how to control, how to put in mechanisms and policies that seek to militarize border communities and that has an adverse effect on migrants themselves. And we see, for instance, the expansion of the Border Patrol and their reach into communities and how that has created many difficulties, especially for migrants that are attempting to make their home in the United States. In California, obviously, we saw the state do a 180 from the mid-90s. Some of you might recall Proposition 187 that was pushed forward by then former Governor Pete Wilson, who really adopted the Save Our State initiative. That was from an extremist right-wing end of a politic that tended to seek to criminalize migrants. And at that point, California was a launching point for a lot of anti-immigrant policies that then the country adopted and started putting forward. So the IRA of 1996, for instance, followed on the coattails of Proposition 187, that then created mechanisms that still have a disastrous effect today for people that are caught up in immigration enforcement. Fortunately, I think on the state level, because we've done that 180, there have been there's an increased awareness, I would say, around constitutional protections and the importance that migrants bring to the state of California. Legislatively, there have been important policies in place from the Trust Act, the Truth Act, and various other measures that I would say wrongly are characterized as sanctuary policies. And I know maybe some of our advocates who I work with might critique me on that, but I just think that when we call something a sanctuary policy, it gives the erroneous impression that ICE and federal government can't conduct immigration raids in the state of California, which we see that that's not the case. But needless to say, the advocacy that has taken place has created a lot of important mechanisms to prevent the ability for local law enforcement, from state law enforcement officials to interact directly when there is a situation around attempting to coordinate enforcement policies around immigration matters. And with state policy SB 54, with California Values Act, which has been an important legislative measure that other states around the country have also followed and adopted their own versions of it, I think is a landmark policy in the state of California that provides that protective matter that instills this sense of that migrants in the state of California should be protected, that their rights should be respected, and that they should be treated with dignity. Insofar as at the local level, we've seen local governments that, especially counties, that attempt to provide some budgets for the possibility of defending people that might be in removal proceedings. We've seen other legislation that attempts to expand here in the county of San Diego. It's expand the preventions of the local sheriff, for instance, from her ability to provide information to ICE that would lead then the needless sharing of information that would then end up, and those individuals could potentially then end up being under ICE custody. And at this point, we don't know where they might go, if they might end up at some sort of torture chamber at another country around the world for which they don't have a nationality to. And so these are some important gains that have taken place at the local level and at the state level. However, they are not without their challenges. We've seen state initiatives that have all but failed, that have attempted to restrict the expansive nature, or the protective nature, I should say, of SB 54. At the local level here, we have some local city councils, the city of El Cajon most prominently, that attempted on its third try pass a resolution that would indemnify its police officers if they were involved with supporting federal immigration agents with enforcement mechanisms. And obviously, I think that would be challenge that they could face with California's Attorney General if, in fact, they are caught with in violation of SB 54. And more than that, I would say what we are seeing now, especially under these extremely difficult times where we are seeing an increase of ICE operations around the county involving other components of the federal government, including Department of Justice and which would include FBI and DEA agents specifically around enforcement matters, that community members are coming together. They are organizing themselves. They are not standing aside with their arms crossed. And it's been really encouraging to see these types of organizing efforts, whether it's checking in on their neighbors, whether it's forming chat groups where they are informing about whether there might be any sort of enforcement event taking place around their neighborhood, or the community patrols process that is really now a part of the resistance of the landscape of grassroots organizing, not only in San Diego County, but also in LA County, and which is expanding to Orange and Riverside counties as well, which involves people in the community that will patrol their neighborhoods. And if they are able to detect the presence of immigration agents, they will inform community members of their presence being there and remind people of what their basic rights are, which have been effective in preventing what I and other people might say kidnappings by the federal government of hardworking members of our communities. And so that's been extremely encouraging to see. And I think to some extent, that community organizing activity and work that has taken place provides, I would hope, some guidance to local elected officials about how the protective nature, the organizing that community groups are able to do provides a sentiment of treating people, again, with respect, with dignity, and that our neighbors shouldn't be targeted, especially when we're seeing a lot of dubious legislation or dubious policies from this administration that don't have any logical sense. And one example of that, and I'll stop after that, has been the presence of ICE at immigration courts, and where they have been detaining people who are suddenly without status because the government attorneys have requested to dismiss the cases against them, and so they essentially are suddenly in a much more vulnerable capacity, and ICE agents will detain them. The presence of community members and organized groups that show up and are witnessing, documenting, providing testimony to what they are seeing is such a valuable resource to be able to say, we will not stand here without doing something. And I think that presents a possible challenge to how we organize and how we don't sit back and let the trampling of our basic constitutional protections take place without us being vocal in that regard. So I'll stop there, and I'm sure there might be questions about this. So thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. Really appreciate that. And it is really beautiful to hear how people are coming out to protect their neighbors in the face of really scary things that are happening in their communities. So thank you for that. Gustavo, I'm going to turn to you. As a journalist covering local stories in the San Diego region, how are you seeing federal, state, and local immigration policies impacting community members?
Oh, well, all kinds of ways. That's basically what my life has been the last couple of months. But as a reporter, I'm in a unique position to be in a place where I can see some of the policies that Jason and Pedro mentioned, right? Some of the policies that are crafted in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and how they impact people on the ground. I know Jason spoke correctly about how this is almost a bipartisan failure, all right, where we're at now. We haven't passed immigration reform, and where does that leave us? Executive orders and legal challenges. That's what our immigration system is built on. So I see that, I saw that during Biden, and I see it now during Trump, especially with the executive orders. I see the detention through deterrence that Pedro mentioned, right? Another way of saying that is that the idea that if we make crossing the border illegally so hard and so dangerous and so difficult that people just won't do it, right? It's a deterrence. Um, it hasn't worked, right? A couple of decades of that policy has shown that it largely underestimates the level of desperation that some people have to flee their country and come over here. And the result of that policy is it hasn't stopped migration much. It has increased death along the border. First, we saw it, I mean, here in San Diego, sort of the epicenter of it, right? It's where the militarization of the border started. Some of the first border walls began over here, and you saw that migration just shifted from the urban center to the mountains and the deserts. And same situation played out in Arizona, in Texas, and more recently we saw that with the first Trump administration increased the size of the border wall, resulted in a lot of death from people falling from that border wall. So I've been covering those stories. But more recently, I think the noticeable shift in coverage has reflected a noticeable shift in enforcement. Whereas during the Biden administration, a lot of the focus was on what was going on south of the border, right? We remember the images of the border encampments. It was historic migration, and not just from Mexico and Central America, but from all over the world. And it didn't stop for a long, long time. So I was spending a lot of time in Tijuana migrant shelters, in some shelters here in San Diego, working with folks on the ground, just kind of documenting the stories of why they were coming and the challenges they were having to enter. That has shifted. Enforcement along the southern border has stopped, reflecting a decrease in immigration from that side. But at the same time, there's been a mass increase in enforcement in the interior of the country, which plays out in all sorts of ways that Pedro and Jason already mentioned. Arrests in immigration courts, raids in El Cajon, at workplaces, people losing their protected status and all of a sudden finding themselves without status overnight. And it's really shifting the population of the people I talked to, right? In the last couple of years, it was migrants in Tijuana, people who didn't speak English, didn't have much of a history in the US. But just in the last week, I mean, I did a story on a grandmother from Escondido who was arrested at work while she was checking in. A soccer coach, also in Escondido, who has been here since he was in high school, right? So I'm talking to a lot of folks who have been in the country for a long time, who identify as American, who don't have a criminal record, or if they do, it's a nonviolent criminal record from years ago, who are getting caught up in President Trump's deportation machine. And with that in mind, I think I just want to end it before we go into questions, because there's a lot of good ones. But part of my job has been correcting lies that the federal government is telling us. And as a reporter, I am neutral, and that's why I feel very confident calling them lies, right? Because you see on national television, administration officials, Stephen Miller, Tom Homan, the border czar, they're telling us a story that all of this is for public safety, to keep us safe from immigration, and that they are prioritizing public safety threats. They're prioritizing people who are a threat to us. But then I talk to a lot of people who get caught in this deportation machine. And like I said, they are grandmothers, soccer coaches. There was a deaf and mute Mongolian man seeking asylum who's detained right now. And if you look at the numbers, the data doesn't match with the rhetoric coming out of DC. The rhetoric is that it's for our protection and it's criminals, but then the data shows it's nonviolent people who have been here a long time. So that's kind of where I'm at right now with the coverage plan, just trying to stay on top of everything as much as I can, but let people know what is actually going on here on the ground.
And Melly, really quick before we move on, I actually have the number that Gustavo was bringing up. So just for everyone's awareness, and this is as of the middle of March. Of course, the data lags a little bit, but as of the middle of March, only 43% of the migrants that had been detained by the administration had been convicted of a crime. I'll repeat that again. As of the middle of March, only 43%, less than half of the migrants that had been detained by the administration had been convicted of a crime. 57% of those detained had never been convicted of a crime as of the middle of March.
Thanks, Jason. I think one phrase that stuck out to me, Gustavo, as you were talking was bipartisan failure, which seems to be kind of a theme.
Yeah.
You know, Jason and Pedro touched on that as well. And so in your recent interview with Tom Cartwright, who has tracked deportation flights since 2020,
Mhm.
when comparing the number of deportation flights under the Biden administration and the second Trump administration, Tom stated that, and I quote, just in terms of numbers, the deportations are really not up from where they were under Biden. So Gustavo, how do you make sense of this gap between the increased anti-immigrant rhetoric coming from Washington and the actual deportation flight numbers?
Mhm. The simplest answer to that question is that it's a lot easier to detain somebody than it is to deport them. And that speaks to a little bit of what Jason and Pedro were talking about, that we have the federal government has spent billions and billions in funding this enforcement mechanism, right? ICE and Border Patrol, they're very good at catching people, but they have chronically underinvested in the immigration court system. So we have a system where you funnel a lot of people into courts that don't have enough immigration lawyers, don't have enough immigration judges. There's what's the backlog at now? More than 3 million cases. So those issues are preventing the deportation numbers from going up. I mean, there are some folks who already have removal orders. There are some folks who can be put through expedited removal proceedings. But a lot of people still have due process rights of going through immigration court, of being able to challenge their deportation, and that takes a lot of time. So I think that's why one of the reasons why you see the numbers lagging a lot. The arrests are up, but the deportations are not. They still need to have their day in court. And at this point, I forget what the total number of immigration judges, but the year started with around 700 immigration judges in the entire country. There's 700 people to adjudicate millions of cases. And that was before the Trump administration, through DOJ, fired a lot of immigration judges. I think the number was around 50 last time I checked. So that will also complicate their deportation numbers at the end of the year.
Thank you. Pedro, the next question is for you. And you kind of touched on this already when describing, communities taking it into their own hands to protect their neighbors. Part of the mission of U.S.-Mexico border program is to work with migrant communities to build collective leadership locally and throughout the border region. So now under this second Trump administration, what are some of the biggest challenges impacting migrant communities? And on the other hand, what are some opportunities does this political moment offer for building community power?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And before I answer the question, I want to add another nuance to the 43% of the individuals that have been labeled as having some sort of criminal background. That my guess is that most of those do not have or have not committed a crime of moral turpitude. That likely a good percentage of those are probably what are known as illegal reentries, and so they're not necessarily crimes as one would typically define them. Regarding the question, challenges, I think some of the greatest challenges right now are the dangerous and toxic narratives that frame migrants as ills to society, and this is something that has carried over from Trump 1.0, right? The bad hombres and all of this disparaging comments and imagery to define people on the move and people who are fleeing violence and harm from their own countries. And I think equally distorted, false, politicized, and misleading narratives about border communities. This idea and notion that border communities are out of control, are chaotic, that they are barren landscapes, that they are places of harm, of violence, when we know that for many years, some of I think El Paso and San Diego have been number 2 and number 3 in populations over 500,000 people named as safest cities or safest regions. I think the only exception to that was after the Trump-inspired massacre at the Walmart in El Paso that changed that category for that specific city. I think some of the challenges are the utter contempt that we see for asylum processes, the failure of the US government now to observe asylum as a fundamental human right, and not being respected under the Constitution and under international agreements. Migrants who are detained are not getting credible fear interviews now, which means that they could quite easily be removed, just like we're seeing in people apprehended at the courts, where they're suddenly being placed in expedited removal proceedings, even though they could have a meritorious case. And because of lack of due process there, I think that, again, the degradation of constitutional protections is a real significant threat that could put people's lives at great risk if they're removed to their own country or to another third country. I think the lack of basic resources, especially in other states that don't have the resources. I was talking to someone that came through the border, an area we know as Whiskey 8. Now he and his spouse are in Ohio, and they can't make rent. They can't, because he doesn't have a work permit. So they're trying to make the best of their lives. And so the lack of resources, lack of resources in their own language, all of these complicate the ability for someone to live sustainably in the United States as they're transitioning to a place where they might not be able to speak and defend themselves in the way that someone who speaks English might be able to. And opportunities for community power, I think, what I mentioned before in terms of how community members are coming together, they're defining how they organize in ways that I think are profoundly reshaping what it means to be neighborly in ways that I think are really important and significant. The increased awareness of what their constitutional protections are and constitutional rights. Since January 5th, we've done probably over 60 Know Your Rights presentations to various community groups, to institutions such as museums, to places of worship, churches, temples. We've done these presentations at people's homes because they don't have the confidence and they have the fear that if they go to a community center that they might be detained. So this is a lot of information that's being provided to community members. I think also how allies are showing up and how allies are supporting their neighbors who are in a much more vulnerable situation. So I think redefining what it means to have privilege and what it means to have privilege in under an environment where people are constantly under threat. If they show up as they should to a court proceeding, that they could be detained there. Over the past couple of days, I've got a couple calls of people that are have appointments to get their fingerprints for immigration cases, and they're fearful that they might not make it out, even though that's not where these detentions have been taking place. So it's just a lot of fear, but at the same time, a lot of positive organizing, and from people that are in an extremely vulnerable situation, but yet still find that resilience to keep moving forward. And oftentimes it's because they've traveled for so many miles through so many countries, because if they go back to their country of origin, it could mean their death for them. And so they are fighting for the ideals of what this country is supposed to represent to them and what this country is supposed to represent to many people who are coming from different places. And so the notion of never again is something that they're living out through their connection with other people in similar situations.
Thank you, Pedro. That's really encouraging and really beautiful to hear about people finding new ways to be resilient, new ways to be neighbors. I really enjoyed hearing about that. And just to add more nuance to the statistic about people with convictions and how many of them have convictions. There's a quote from Silky Shaw, who is an executive director of Detention Watch Network, who I really respect, and she says, this is why we must fight for everyone, whether they've been incarcerated or have had contact with the criminal legal system or are merely undocumented. When you accept that some people are deserving of detention and deportation, the scope who is eligible is always under the threat of expanding. All right, Jason, I'm going to turn to you. I wanted to ask you this question because I've definitely seen a difference on the state level. So what are key differences between the first Trump administration and the present one in terms of the response from Democrats in Washington, how your constituents are feeling and resistance generally? I know in Sacramento, I have seen that legislators are much more timid to challenge these policies. And I'm wondering what that looks like at the federal level.
So good question. And I would say the second time around has its similarities and differences from the first time around. So I was here for Trump 1.0, which is definitely allowed me to better withstand what's happening under Trump 2.0, because the strategy from a political and from a governing perspective is pretty much the same, and it's chaos. So what you do is you throw so much out into the ecosystem all at once that it makes it impossible for any individual to be able to keep track of everything that's going on. And however, a key difference between Trump 2.0 versus Trump 1.0 is that in Trump 1.0 that was done, but now it's on overdrive. So like in Trump 1.0, specifically from the immigration situation, we had the attempted visa ban, which was deliberately targeting Muslims. But like that was the issue. So we can consolidate around the potential visa ban as we were battling, a border wall and certain other changes. Now it's just there's a lot more that's happening all at once, which makes it a bit more difficult. One thing that Democrats have done as a caucus in Washington, D.C., to be able to better manage the situation is that we've really become hyper focused on our areas of jurisdiction. So rather than any individual member of Congress attempting to keep track of everything that's going on all at once, whether it's immigration, whether it's environmental laws, whether it's labor laws, whether it's diplomacy and foreign affairs, whether it's DOGE, and cuts to federal employees and federal employment. So there's so much going on. So we've really focused on what our areas of jurisdiction are. So what do I mean by that? Well, for example, Congressman Peters is on 2 committees. He's on the budget committee, which is pretty self-explanatory. He's voting on the budgets. So he's going through the nitty-gritty of the budget itself and looking at the math behind the budget. A quick note that I would make about the budget, which I think is important for people to be aware of. The United States debt right now, so the amount of money that we've overspent on our credit card is about $36 trillion. So we have a debt right now of about $36 trillion. Really important because there are some members of Congress that like to bring up being fiscally conservative and express concerns about spending. Those concerns only seem to translate when the opposing party has control of the White House. And why do I bring that up? Well, out of the 36 trillion, 20% of that, 7 trillion, 20% of the entire debt this nation has accumulated in 250 years was done under Trump 1.0 in the first 4 years of Trump being president. 20% of all the debt in the history of this country was accumulated under 4 years of Donald Trump. Now, some people will say, well, it was COVID, so we had to respond to COVID. That's true. But guess what? About 5% of the debt, between 5 and 10%, it's about 4 trillion, 3 to 4 trillion, was accumulated before COVID. So $3 to $4 trillion, it's about 10% of the entire debt of this country, was accumulated under Republican majorities prior to COVID. So these are the focuses of my boss on the budget committee is you keep talking about debt and being worried about deficits, but that only seems to apply when a Democrat is in the White House, doesn't apply when a Republican. So that's the first one. The other one that my boss is on the Energy and Commerce Committee. So the Energy and Commerce Committee has jurisdiction, for example, over healthcare and our healthcare system. So we've been speaking out and very vocal about cuts to Medicaid and the hundreds of thousands here in San Diego that could lose Medicaid coverage, the millions across the country, almost 15 million that could lose Medicare coverage under the current bill that's being pushed through Congress, the current reconciliation bill. So we're hyper-focused on that. Also in the Energy and Commerce Committee, we cover environmental regulations. So we're worried about rescinding some of the environmental regulations and some of the incentives that have been put in place to transition to renewable energy, whether it's electric, whether it's wind, whether it's water and hydro. So we're involved in those debates. And right now we're having to fight because there's an attempt to try to keep coal going, to try to increase use of oil and increase of natural gas. So that's where we're focused because that's our committees. But again, everyone focuses on their own committees. So in particular with regards to immigration, immigration largely lands under the Judiciary Committee. So we have Democratic members of the Judiciary Committee that are hyper focused on what's going on in the immigration realm and the legal nuances and the different proposals in terms of immigration. But you can look across the board. The Ways and Means Committee handles taxes. So people on the Ways and Means Committee are focused on taxes. We have each committee basically has its own area of jurisdiction in which those members are focused on. So that's a big change that we've seen from Trump 1.0. It was chaotic, but we were still able to kind of manage the broader scheme of things. Whereas right now under Trump 2.0, we've largely zeroed in on our areas of jurisdiction. So even though we're in San Diego, so we do keep close tabs, for example, on the thousands of people that have been laid off at the Veterans Affairs, the VA. We keep track of what's going on in immigration because of our proximity to the San Diego border. So there are other areas that we keep track of simply because of our geography in San Diego. But for the most part, every member of the Democratic Party caucus has been told to hyper focus on your area of jurisdiction, and then we can compile reports from each of the different committees so that everybody has a place that they can go to get their questions answered.
Thank you, Jason. Gustavo, I'm gonna turn back to you. Speaking of chaos from Washington, every day we're bombarded with news from the Trump administration related to immigration enforcement, detention, and deportations. And as a border city, border region with thriving immigrant communities, San Diego is at the epicenter for all things immigrants and immigration, migration. So in this time of information overload and chaos, how do you decide what to investigate? And what stories do you follow and why?
Gosh, I think the priority is to take care of yourself and your own sanity, just because it is so easy to be overwhelmed. I know, like Jason said, right, that's part of the strategy is to kind of flood the system with so many, I call it the outreach cycle, which I experienced during the first Trump term as a reporter. There were all these stories, especially the first couple of months. Trump did this, Trump said that. Oh man, you should be really freaked out about this, that, and the other. And I think news consumers got burned out by that, or it was just too much cry wolf, or there's only so many things you could be outraged at one time. And it's just not fun to be that reactive, even as a reporter, right? Because then you're just chasing things. So I think I try to, well, limit what I focus on, and I try to limit that to how does it impact people here in San Diego? And how does it impact people here in San Diego directly that I can talk to? And how do I show that story? Just because I think that's something, KPBS can do, and we're not a national outlet. We don't have to report from the Beltway. We don't really do those policy stories without individual people. And I think that does a couple things. One, it limits the scope of what I can do, but it also centers people in the stories. And just for me personally, it's more rewarding to just talk to people, right? And the stories are tragic. I mentioned the deaf mute Mongolian man, the grandmother from Escondido. I think telling those stories, there's a sense of like part of my process is reporting those stories and getting them out there, and that like they are emotionally draining. I mean, therapy helps, but it also helps to get the story out there and to know that as a reporter, I'm doing my small part in educating people about what's going on. And I think that's something similar to what Pedro mentioned. That is part of the beauty of the moment, is seeing different people step up. Right. In the story I did about the folks, which Pedro mentioned the situation, right? People are getting arrested by ICE when they're going to their immigration court hearings. Part of the reason we know that is because there are a lot of really good people who took time out of their day to volunteer to be at that courthouse and just be observers. Same thing, I mean, when the migrant drop-offs were happening during the Biden administration, no one from the city of San Diego responded. People responded, nonprofits, mutual aid networks. I hear the refrain over and over again for multiple stories is that there's a lack of leadership coming from San Diego on immigration issues. This was during Biden. And I would ask the mayor's office, hey, I keep on hearing this on the ground. Do you want to respond? Not once did they respond, which kind of proved their point, right? Lack of local leadership on this issue. And in the absence of that local leadership, I think, a combination of lack of local leadership, recognition that there's bipartisan lack of action to give us this current immigration system, people are taking ownership of their own agency. People are saying, I'm not going to wait for some politician to, or somebody, anybody. I'm not going to wait for other people to come and do something for me. I'm going to organize and build community and take it upon ourselves to do something about it, right? The ICE patrols that Pedro mentioned, I did a ride along with them at 5 in the morning in Linda Vista. And I think just that process of staying active gives people a sense of purpose during these times. And when you have some kind of activity and some kind of direction to your actions, it does prevent it from getting too overwhelming. When you feel like you're doing something about it, I think that makes the current time easier to manage.
Thank you, Gustavo. I really like what you said about talking to people and leading with stories over policies.
Oh, we're so isolated right now, not just politically. So yeah, I think that's really important.
Yeah, yeah. Pedro, I'm really glad I get to ask this question to you because I feel like as someone who works on statewide immigration enforcement policy, I feel like the San Diego region is kind of like the testing ground for a lot of immigration enforcement. What we see in San Diego often spreads to other parts of California. Like I first heard about the court arrest in San Diego, and then I heard about it in Orange County. And so from your perspective, what types of policies on the local, state, or federal, you can choose any level you like, what would be most helpful and impactful to migrant communities AFSC supports and collaborates with?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I would say at the federal level, if I could just like break it down, summarize, it would be related to accountability, oversight, and transparency. Precisely because we are seeing that the government agencies that were charged with that, the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, now will, after, and I submitted a declaration as part of the lawsuit that moved forward over the past couple of weeks that is being debated, and the response has been to create like a skinny CRCL. So Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, it's under the Department of Homeland Security, charged with looking at patterns of practice, right, of misconduct by agencies or by agents that turn to become patterns of abuse or abusive practices. And one example of that was when Border Patrol was forcing migrants, most of whom were asylum seekers, to remain in open-air detention sites for roughly almost 2 years, and which just literally stopped in February of this year. And at those open-air detention sites, where some of them, what we were able to document, stayed for up to 7 days. And these are sites that are out in the open air. There's absolutely no infrastructure. The only infrastructure that was there was 4 porta potties and a large 1,000-gallon container of water that we were able to get support from State Senator Steve Padilla to put that in there. After we were able to say, look, there are infants that are here, there are elderly folks that are here. There's a 10-month child, infant who is no longer taking breast milk from her mom, and she's listless, and she's in a situation where she might die. She's had diarrhea for a day and a half. So pointing this out, and these are the types of cases or situations that we would form into complaints and submit to the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. And at a moment where we're seeing so much disregard for constitutional protections and for human rights, these oversight mechanisms, for all the faults that they had, at the very minimum, serve the purpose for us to be able to present something to the government. And that's what we would want when members of Congress or when senators are visiting their districts, that they make the point of visiting the detention centers, that they make the point, because that's their obligation, that's their authority that they have, that they visit the Otay Mesa Detention Center or any other detention center and say, what is happening here? Where, what we saw in Newark, New Jersey, where the member of Congress there was facing arrest because he made an unannounced visit, which is his authority to do so. And so that's what we would want to see, accountability, oversight, and transparency in terms of mechanisms that are put in place. In terms of the state level, I definitely would love to see policies that we have, which the ones that I mentioned earlier, that are strengthened, that we look at increasing the obstacles for local and state agencies to collaborate with federal immigration agencies, specifically because there are a lot of loopholes, and ICE and Border Patrol have access to databases that police forces put together, whether it's through automated license plate readers or other types of surveillance technologies that funnel a massive amount of data points that are accessible to federal agencies. So trying to find ways to prevent that access would be important. And then I think just locally, having a genuine dialogue process with our mayors, with our county board of supervisors, so that they put forward initiatives that seek to protect migrants, hopefully with funding, with real budgets that then are locally are supporting people that are in a much more vulnerable situation, given that the federal government right now is not is trying to move away from that.
Thank you, Pedro. So yeah, Jason, as Senator Peters' district director, what are the most common concerns you're hearing from constituents with respect to immigration and immigration enforcement? And how do you respond to those concerns?
I think the number one thing that I would bring up, and this is bigger than just immigration, but I'll zero in a minute on the immigration aspects. It's simply due process. I mean, there are constitutional protections in terms of due process. Like our Constitution talks about the importance of due process, talks about search and seizure, talks about harmful punishments and undue punishment. Like this is in our founding document from 1776, from some 1780s. Like, and yet we see that ignored, or what it appears to be, that Constitution is just being ignored. So a big one is definitely the due process, and breaking it down in terms of immigration, the idea that an administration would admit in court that it wrongfully deported people and then act like it can do nothing to bring them back, even when the Supreme Court tells them that they have to bring them back. I mean, that puts us very close to a constitutional crisis. When the Supreme Court tells the administration, you broke the law, the administration admits it broke the law, and yet they still don't want to rectify that. So we get a lot of concerns, particularly around due process, but also due process for immigrants. The other one that I would say is just this idea that everyone's a member of a gang. You're a member of Tren de Aragua. You're a member of MS-13. You're part of the Sinaloa cartel. I mean, the administration says this all the time, but when you look at the court cases, they don't actually present any evidence. And that's another one that we get a lot of concerns about is that our system is formulated on the basis where, Congress passes a law, the administration implements a law, and then the courts decide whether the law is being implemented properly, whether the law is unconstitutional. And we're just not seeing any of that. It's very dangerous. So again, due process something. The other is the undermining of our broader Democratic Party system is something that we hear about a lot, but it comes into play with a lot of what's happening with the immigrants. I mean, it's one thing for somebody to go on TV or during a campaign and just make statements. It's another one you go in front of a judge and in a court of law, and you're making statements that you can't substantiate with any type of evidence whatsoever. So that's a big one, is the due process one. And the last one that I would add that we hear about a lot is the impact that this is having on communities. I mean, Pedro brought up some of these examples. Gustavo brought up some of these examples. An 85-year-old abuela in Escondido getting arrested and potentially getting deported, the administration said that it was going to go after criminals. It was going to go after dangers to society. I don't think the abuela that's 85 years old that's cooking tamales for the whole neighborhood for Christmas is a danger to society. I don't think the 7-year-old that's trying to go to elementary school and learn English getting picked up by ICE is making us safer. So that's a big concern that we hear, is kind of this indiscriminate nature of who's being detained. And the last one that I would add to this is the painting of everybody with a broad brush is also something that our constituents feel. Because if you're here from Afghanistan on temporary protective status or humanitarian parole, your story is going to be very different as a person than if you're here from Ukraine, or if you're here from Venezuela, or if you're here from Cuba, or even from Mexico. So with the people that call us, they know their neighbor that fled the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the threats that they experienced in their family, and they're like, why is this person in danger? They know their teacher or their coach in the soccer league that came here from Venezuela because Maduro's government was threatening his family. They're like, how is this guy doing something wrong? He's just been our soccer coach for 5 years. He's never broken the law. So there's that personal connection that the members of our community have with the migrants themselves, and they just can't understand why is it that the administration is targeting these well-meaning members of our society that haven't broken any laws except for, being here without a visa or being here in undocumented status. They've been contributing members of society. So we get a lot of calls that are concerned about due process, that are concerned about the broader impacts that this has within the neighborhoods themselves, and particularly that are concerned about a potential constitutional crisis when the administration is just ignoring rulings by our judges, including the Supreme Court.
Thank you, Jason. I have one more question for each panelist, but Savannah, I also want to honor the questions we're getting in the chat. So how would you like me to proceed?
Yeah, I think if we can start taking some questions from those in the chat, and then if we have time for the final questions that you have for them, that'd be great. But yeah, there's a lot of good questions, I think, in the chat, so we can probably transition there.
Okay, and will you be selecting the questions from?
Sure. Yeah, I could definitely help out with that. I think we have a lot of questions in the chat that we can cover right now about immigration rights, red cards, and whether those cards, you think they're working in communities? Are they really helpful for folks? And beyond sharing just the red cards, what do you see as a great way for us to help our communities in this time specifically, beyond that resource?
Yeah, and I'm happy to take that question. That's fine. Yeah, and I do believe that the red cards work, and the red cards, if you're not familiar with them, they are they're two-sided. On the one side, it provides instructions to the person that's using them, and on the other side, it provides instructions to the immigration agents or the DOJ agents or whatever law enforcement agency might be there. And they are available in multiple languages. These were initially introduced in the late 2000s by the ILRC, a legal organization out of the Bay Area, which has done wonderful work. So I do believe they work. However, the caveat that I have is the idea of using the red cards is that you would want to assert your rights. You want to make sure that the immigration agents, whether it's ICE or Border Patrol or whichever other law enforcement agency, ensures that they know that you know your rights, that they have been alerted to the fact that you are presenting them with information about what your rights are. However, under the INA, the Immigration Naturalization Act, there's a requirement where people that have a certain status, whether that be DACA or TPS or LPR status under a visa or whatever it might be, anytime there's contact with an immigration agent, and they're asking you about your status, you are required to provide that information to them. With a new registration requirement, it adds another much more complicated wrinkle to that. So oftentimes what I tell people is if you have one of these statuses that you must present that when it's asked of you. If that's not sufficient for the immigration agent, then at that point, you can pull out the red card and say, I've provided you with the information I need to provide you. At this point, I don't want to answer any more questions. Here's this card, and I'm exercising my rights. That's normally, there are other broader aspects of how to use a red card that I'd like to inform people. But that's generally to be brief. I do believe the red cards work. There is a strategy about how one might use them to ensure the broadest protection that you might want to have if in contact with the law enforcement agent.
Great, thank you so much. I think that covered, a lot of folks had questions about the red card, so appreciate that. Let's go to, this question from Armando. Would you say a second amnesty act, such as the one from 1986, be the one or one of the solutions to immigration or these immigration reforms that you were kind of talking about? I think this question is for you, Jason.
So I tend to we try to stay away from amnesty. I think one thing that makes some of the immigration reform difficult is painting everything with a broad brush. And there's a very big difference in the circumstances that brought Ukrainians to this country, that brought Afghans to this country, Cubans, Venezuelans, Mexicans. There are very different people from China, from India, from all over the world. There are very different circumstances that brought people to our shores, that brought them to the United States, seeking safety, seeking a better life, or for whatever reason they were coming here. And also, the reason why I stay away from it is because the word is toxic from a political standpoint. So we might say amnesty as Democrats, but you say amnesty and you've already lost the Republican Party. So we have to learn how to use language that's palatable to people on both sides of the aisle when it comes to comprehensive immigration reform. So Dreamers is something that everybody seems to connect with. How do we give Dreamers a pathway to permanent status and legal status here in the United States of America? How do we give people who are here who want to work or want to come here to work a way to work? For those that don't know, there are about 7 million job openings in the United States of America right now. Historically, we've always used immigrants to help fill those gaps in terms of employment. There are a lot of baby boomers that are about to retire, and we're going to have a lot more openings in job force. Immigrants have typically filled those gaps. So when we talk in terms of if you want to come to this country and you want to work hard and you want to earn a living, let's find a way that you can do that. Right now, you can't do that. There are extensive wait times for people just to get a work visa to come here to work in a job. So we have to change the words that we're using in order to ensure that we're using terms that are palatable to people on both sides of the aisle. And oftentimes, you got to start with the baby steps. So if we can start with helping Dreamers, that's a success. If we can start by giving people a legal pathway to come here to work, that's a success. Let's take it step by step and compromise on these groups that most Democrats and most Republicans seem to be on board with us doing something for them. But we got to be very careful with the terminology, and amnesty is just a term that does not work amongst most Republicans.
That's really helpful information. Thank you. And related to that, I'll ask this question too, since it's kind of connected, I'd say. What thoughts do you have about how we can make the necessary changes to we all seem to agree are the problems in terms of immigration policy and reform? What can be done and why are we not addressing this?
So great question. I think I touched on it a little bit, but ultimately, one of the biggest hurdles that we have is determining what our red lines are. So it would be easier for us to be able to come up with a compromise if we had clearer red lines on the Democratic Party side and also on the Republican Party side. So what is something that we cannot compromise on? When we know what the areas are that we can't compromise on, then we can look at what the areas that we can compromise are. So, for example, one that's very tough on the Democratic Party side is the idea of hiring more officers for the Department of Homeland Security. But that's something that Republicans want. And there are some Democrats that could be on board with that, with the idea of, okay, maybe we can hire some more Border Patrol agents. Maybe we can hire some more customs agents at the ports. Maybe in building a compromise in exchange for hiring more Border Patrol agents and more customs agents, maybe more ICE agents, we put in place some additional transparency requirements. We put in place some restrictions on some of the enforcement tactics that they're using. So it's really, it's a puzzle, and we have to find a way to put those pieces together. But starting with the red lines helps. Then the other thing is, where do we seem to be in agreement on right now? I brought up Dreamers. I brought up work visas. I brought up the fact that we have green cards that we're not even using, even though Congress has already approved them. So there's certain areas where we do have broader agreement already. I think that those are areas where we can make progress on. But ultimately, what it comes down to is there's no home run that fixes immigration. It's just not going to be possible for us to come up with one bill that fixes immigration. So we're going to have to start taking little steps. But to me, if you're moving forward, you're not moving backward, and that's a good thing. The key to progressive is progress. So you have to make progress if you want to be a progressive. To be progressive, we should be making steps forward. That is progress. So let's see what little bills we can pass, and don't sacrifice the good for the sake of the perfect. Like, let's get something done, no matter how small it is, it's going to touch millions of lives, and let's start there.
Thank you. And now these next couple of questions turn more to the advocacy and community protection aspect. So probably Gustavo or Pedro, if you want to answer any of these, feel free. So the first one is, when average Californians witness ICE activity in their neighborhoods, especially detentions that may appear sudden or unjust, what are the safest, most practical, and most effective actions they can take in the moment to support their neighbors and uphold California's immigration protections? And is there anything that can be done to stop this activity in the moment?
I can start if you want, Gustavo. I think, yeah, I mean, as much as we're able to provide information about basic rights to people, especially those in our vulnerable, much more vulnerable situation than others might be, I think that's where to begin. And so informing people what the difference is between an administrative warrant is and a judicial warrant, and how those are used, and what are the tactics that ICE use when they go to someone's home and are lying about whether an individual lived there who has never lived there, but it's just a pretext to enter that home. And so trying to understand the different tactics is always helpful, providing this information to the public so that they could protect themselves. And this is, basic steps that community members are able to do. Organizing themselves, understanding who their neighbors are, obviously not going around and asking about status, because I don't think that would be the right approach, but just being a good friend, being a good neighbor. And I think that begins to break down the metaphorical walls that we carry forward. And I think is a way to begin developing relationships about why we need to protect each other, and recognize people's humanity, that how people that are involved in immigration processes oftentimes have an extremely difficult and unfair process that they are experiencing, especially those that are in a much more, as I mentioned before, vulnerable situation where they might not know what basic step they need to take. So documenting, witnessing, asking federal agents directly without impeding. Obviously, if someone wants to take that role, then that's a whole different step around civil disobedience that they would want to take. And I'm not suggesting that people should do that lightly. There should definitely be a much more thorough conversation about what that might look like, where there's protection for themselves as well.
Yeah, only one little thing to add to that from the reporter's perspective. I do think it's extremely important to document what you're seeing when you're seeing it, but I also think it's important, arguably more important, to verify before you share, just because there's a lot of well-meaning people who want to get involved, who want to warn their friends and family, but it results in rumors spreading pretty quickly, and we saw that here in San Diego early on. We would see a well-meaning person would notice a Border Patrol vehicle parked in front of a hospital, and then it would get word out, oh my, they're raiding the hospital. No, they're not raiding the hospital. It's common when people who are crossing get injured that Border Patrol, as first responders, take them to the hospital. Saw similar things with Border Patrol cars in front of certain restaurants. Oh, the restaurant's getting raided. Oh, no, it was two Border Patrol agents out for lunch during their work. And I think there's a lot of damage, obviously, with those rumors are spreading. There's a lot of legitimate fear and anxiety in immigrant communities in San Diego and throughout California. And if they're sitting at home seeing that, a raid, just that creates a lot of stress, a lot of unnecessary stress. They will stay in, they'll think twice about going out. So that's why I think it's very important to verify before you share.
And just really quick, contact your member of Congress. So if you see something and it looks suspicious or you're unsure about it, call your member of Congress. I can contact Border Patrol. I can contact ICE. I can contact the Department of Homeland Security to figure out what is actually going on. If your member of Congress is not available or maybe unwilling to help here in California, contact one of your senators, Senator Adam Schiff, Senator Alex Padilla. So definitely reach out to us, because I can tell you that I've looked into reports that constituents have called me about to verify whether it's true or not. And Gustavo brought it up. We had an issue at one of the hospitals, and we want Border Patrol to take children to a children's hospital to get treatment if they need it. But people thought that there was something else going on there, which is very difficult. So really, if you see something, call your member of Congress, call your senator, and we can find out whether it's problematic and we need to get involved, or whether it's just a couple of agents having lunch.
Great, thank you for all that. That's definitely important as we all look to protect our communities in these challenging times for sure. Related to that, this next question also talks more about the advocacy side of things. What are some concrete advocacy actions that individuals or religious congregations and communities and things like that and other communities take in this time?
I'll say one, and then I'm sure Pedro and Gustavo might have some other ideas. It's important to humanize what's happening. And Pedro's brought this up, Gustavo's brought that up. I know I brought it up before, but I do want to emphasize that point. Again, there are major differences in what migrants have experienced based on the country that they are coming here from. There's also major differences in what migrants experience from within one country. If you're from Afghanistan and you're Pashtun or you're Hazara, those can be two very different experiences. If you're coming here from Mexico and you used to live in Sinaloa or used to live in Chiapas, you might have a very different experience that has brought you here. So it's the humanization aspect. So we talk about the people that are being deported, the people that are being detained, the people that are arriving at our border. We have these big, broad numbers, but sometimes we lose the human element to who they actually are. So a key to advocacy, in my opinion, in regards to immigration, it's something that really connects across the aisle, is when you give it that human aspect. The coach for your little league soccer team or your little league softball team, the substitute teacher that came in for a week and really impressed your children, the maid, the gardener, the construction worker that you've known for 25 years. Let's humanize who these people are and make it more difficult to then dehumanize them so they can be treated the way that they've sometimes been treated.
Absolutely. Thank you. Pedro or Gustavo, did you want to add anything on that question?
We've mentioned some examples, I think, already, but anyone can. I think there's a lot of opportunities. You just have to go out and find them. It could be just donating food to a mutual aid network. Water drops have been a thing for a long time. I mentioned the court observers. I wrote a story about a German tourist who was, detained at the border trying to cross. The person who helped her had no idea who she was, right? The German person's friend put out something on TikTok, and this Good Samaritan who lived near the Otay detention center took it upon herself to reach out and go there and visit people. And there are volunteers who visit the detention center too. Those are the ones I've come in contact with through my reporting, but Pedro, you might have more options. I mean, there are a lot of opportunities out there for folks.
Yeah, I think one I would add, especially because there's the religious component, and the American Friends Service Committee is a Quaker organization, and there's a lot of wonderful history of solidarity movements involving religious organizations and Quaker organizations in the sanctuary movement, not only in the 1980s, but also in the new sanctuary movement in the early 2000s that the American Friends Service Committee, along with other Quaker congregations, were involved in. I think, there's a lot of talk about the crisis at the border. And I think if we were to reframe it, I think it's important, as one of my colleagues says, there's a really genuinely a moral crisis taking place, right? And so if we look at, if you're inclined to a specific faith tradition, what does your faith tradition teach you about how to respond to injustice, right? And I think that could be a guiding a guiding light for how to respond to this situation or situations that we find ourselves in. There are some congregations that are now suing the federal government because of the removal of the protected sites, the memorandums that prevented immigration raids from taking place in certain sensitive locations, including places of worship, schools, clinics, hospitals, those sorts of locations. And so, there are various different types of actions that congregations can take to support their neighbors and members of their congregation.
Thank you. Those were great answers. Definitely helpful for folks to keep in mind for sure. I think these next couple of questions relate to some of the earlier comments made about local law enforcement responding to ICE and cooperating with them. So are deputies or DAs or sheriffs or anything like that in jeopardy of being sued by the federal government or in any other means if they cooperate with ICE? Whoever wants to answer that.
Yeah, I think it would be the reverse, right? So that if they're not cooperating, so there are attempts by this administration to name and expose local jurisdictions or local states that are quote unquote like sanctuary states, and there's this new terminology that has been used to describe the Board of Supervisors of San Diego County, which is known as a super sanctuary jurisdiction, which really has no other meaning than to be used as a scare tactic. But so the idea is that the administration would go after and seek to penalize those jurisdictions that are not participating in these massive roundups. We've yet to see concrete steps of what that might look like. So I really don't know what the next steps would be for this administration to pursue any type of penalty or any type of penalty of people that are law enforcement officials that are not participating in these massive roundups of raids. And so, but that could be coming. We don't know.
Did anyone else have any comments on that question? If not, I'll move on to the next question.
Sorry, no, I'm not a lawyer, and I think it would depend on what the state AG says, what the federal government does. There's a lot of questions about that, but it's definitely an idea that's been floated around.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I'll turn back to policy a little bit here. This question is directed at Jason. Back in early 2024 or whatever time they say, there was a bipartisan bill that sounded pretty hopeful for a comprehensive immigration reform, but was held back due to politics. What is your assessment of that bill in general, and are there any thoughts on whether that could be resurrected in the current climate?
So another good question. I think the bill is dead. And the reason why I think the bill is dead is I've talked about compromise and making sacrifices. In that bill, it was almost entirely Democrats who were making sacrifices. So the bill that we saw last year was almost entirely focused on enforcement. It did very little about status issues and the undocumented population in this country. And yet Democrats were willing to make that sacrifice just to make a small step forward on getting a change implemented. And as many of you witnessed, for political reasons, the bill was then tanked by the people that originally wrote it, because we had candidates running for office that didn't want it to pass because then their opponents could campaign on it. So this is why immigration remains a problem. You explicitly had Donald Trump saying, do not pass this bill because this helps my opponent. And Donald Trump was saying a bill helps his opponent that Democrats had basically made all the sacrifices for just to take a step forward. So, I mean, I don't think that bill is going to come back again because Democrats were making all the sacrifices, but it's a good example of we can make sacrifices. We can come together and create bipartisan bills. If only we were able to vote on it in the House and the Senate, we'd probably get enough votes to even overcome a veto. It's just a matter of sitting down, having those hard conversations, and coming up with a proposal on paper that can get the votes in the House and the Senate.
Thank you for that. I think a lot of people are probably wondering what those kind of bills might look like going forward. So helpful information as well. These next couple of questions are kind of connected, so I'll ask them together. What is the safest thing we can do to help people interacting with ICE and being taken by ICE when they're not respecting red card rights and things like that? And also, is it permissible for observers to ask to see ICE agents' badges and credentials, or is that considered interference? So whoever wants to start those two questions.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it really depends on what the attitude is of the ICE agent, right? And this idea. And so if there is an enforcement event taking place out in the public, there really isn't an expectation of privacy, right? So you do have the right to request information of the agents, badge numbers and things of that nature, their name, what agency they represent, because oftentimes they might not have identifying information, especially if they're wearing plain clothes and that's the only, and maybe a badge, and that's the only way that they're presenting themselves. I think where it gets a little difficult is if they are apprehending someone and if the individual is invading personal space or mistakenly touches an agent, that could be possibly construed as impeding the federal operation. So there are always certain types of boundaries that need to be, one needs to be cautious about. You know, in terms of the work I do, when we do trainings about how to respond to ICE raids, we usually tend to say, don't get in between ICE agents because it could be interpreted as you're in the middle of an operation. So especially if the intention is not to interfere, then you're observing, you're documenting, you're witnessing, which has an important role as well, especially if you're able to document any abusive practices in the case of not respecting the red card or the information. And this is something I tell people: the red card is not a magical document, right? I mean, the agents will violate people's rights regularly because they feel that they're emboldened to do so, that they have that authority. And so the best thing from my perspective is to document and then follow up with how to use that documentation to support the person that was detained.
Great, thank you. Melanie, did you have any final question for our panelists? Otherwise, maybe we can ask them for their final thoughts before we wrap up.
Yeah, since we're at time, I'll just let folks, yeah, their last thoughts. I guess, okay, Gustavo, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'll go. Well, first, I just thank you for the League of Women's Voters. I really appreciate you inviting me and creating this conversation. I do really appreciate it. I don't really have any parting words of wisdom. Yeah, I don't know. There's so much uncertainty right now, and I think it's okay that there are no parting words of wisdom. I think it's okay that things are uncertain right now. Things are changing by the minute or the day, depending on court orders and different executive orders. I think, I don't know, just be present. That's what I'm trying to do through the reporting. And like I said before, I do think it's very important to build community wherever you can find it.
I'll give a
Jason,
couple.
go ahead. And then Pedro.
So I'll give two that I think are important. Number one is every political problem has a political solution. It's a matter of finding the politicians that are gonna make this a priority and are gonna fight for it until we can get across the finish line. Our broken immigration system is a political problem. It's a system that's been allowed to deteriorate for years and years and years, and we have not passed a political solution. But it has a political solution. It's just a matter of getting it done. And the second one is all long-term solutions in this country throughout our 250 years have been bipartisan. There's no Democratic Party solution that lasts generation through generation. There's no Republican Party solution that lasts generation through generation. We need to get back to a point where we can sit down and have difficult conversations with people that we can adamantly disagree on in certain aspects, but find a place that we do have an area of agreement. And immigration is one of those where there can be some areas of immigration that we have adamant disagreements about, but there's got to be a little snippet that if we sit down and talk to each other, we can find some common ground in order to move forward on. And bipartisanship is not a bad thing. We have to stop getting mad at people that are willing to reach across the aisle and speak to members of the other political parties. So remember, political problems have political solutions, and bipartisanship is not a bad thing. We need to come together and find a way to compromise again.
I'll close out, and I'll say that hopefully I'll start out by being a little bit more dismal in my outlook, but hopefully end with some hopeful thoughts. And I think some of what we're seeing are structural changes to our country, to our democracy. The current administration, when not in place, there's some structural changes that have occurred that I think will take generations to repair, irrespective of who ends up at the White House. And so that causes me a lot of alarm. There are, we're 3 months into this, and or a little bit more than 3 months, and we still have a lot more to go. There's a significant damage that has been done, and I think what I worry about is other sorts of mean-spirited legislation that might be coming down the pike. Back in the fall of last year, there was HR 9495, which some of our members of Congress voted in favor of before there was a lot of backlash. This is known as a nonprofit bill killer. And so that's a possibility that could show up again. And the possibility of undermining the work that community organizations are doing is real. The targeting of human rights defenders is real. The targeting of journalists and people that are in opposition to the legislation is significant. And so we have, I think we've yet to reach a point where we can say, okay, we've reached the tipping point. On the other hand, though, what I described earlier, we have a lot of important organizing that's taking place in the communities. People are becoming social agents. They're giving us direction for how to build a true participatory democracy, and that's hopeful, and that provides us with the guidance for how we build relationships ultimately that are built on trust, on respecting our human dignity, and that's what I'm aiming for, and I'm hoping that we can see more of that in our community as we move forward.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great way to end it. Thank you all. We are just a little over our time, so we want to respect everyone's time. Thank you so much to our speakers today. Thank you, Melanie, for moderating the discussion. This was a great discussion. We apologize if we couldn't get to your question in the Q&A. There was just too many good questions. We are wrapping this up now. I will send out a follow-up email to participants tomorrow with the recording, including any resources that our speakers have shared. So you will be getting that tomorrow as well. Thank you again for participating in this webinar and all of our events in our advocacy webinar series this spring. You can check those out on YouTube under our League of Women Voters of California page. And before we fully wrap up, I'll pass it over to our development director, Christy, to close us out.
Wow, thank you all. That was really incredible. And I will be very brief and just a reminder, one of the panelists spoke about during this time of turmoil and fear, the ability to take action, at least for me, brings me a lot of comfort to work for the League and to have such incredible partners throughout the state that are able to take action and make some incredible change. And, if you have the capability or capacity to support the LWVC Action Fund, Savannah will put the link in the chat. Please, all donations really make a big difference for the work that we do in Sacramento in advocating for and against legislation that protects our communities. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I hope everyone has a great evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.